Hey, what's up, sports fans? Welcome to Common Sense Sports Talk. My name is Andrew Freeman, and with the NBA season officially here, what I'm going to be doing in this episode is previewing the 2019-2020 NBA season while also giving my standings predictions for the upcoming year. Now, before I get started, I just wanted to say that if you're a fan of this channel, please leave a like and subscribe below. It really goes a long way towards building this channel into what I want it to eventually be. And, of course, if you have opinions that you want to share on the NBA, and really the upcoming season as a whole, please leave your thoughts in the comment section. I'd love to discuss with you guys what your thoughts are on the upcoming year in the NBA. You can also follow me on Twitter for additional notices about this channel and just to talk about sports in general, because I'm always active on Twitter expressing my opinions out there. So without further ado, let's get into this here. And before I get to my predictions of what the standings are going to be like for the Eastern and Western Conference, I just wanted to go over the 5 major storylines or so that I think will be there this season. So the first major storyline for me, coming off of a really wild offseason where there's a lot of movement in terms of star players, Kawhi going to LA, AD going to LA, bunch of big trades, bunch of big signing trades, just a lot of moving pieces. You know, we're kind of seeing the end of what was really a decade or so of the super team era, where teams are just trying to stockpile as many stars as possible and just overwhelm opposing teams with high-end talents. We're not really seeing that anymore in this year's NBA. We're seeing a lot more of a spread-out NBA as a whole, really more of an emphasis on NBA duos, player duos, instead of these super teams that have kind of dominated the league for quite a while here. And I think this is a really good thing for the NBA as a whole. It makes it a lot more balanced. It makes it a lot more unpredictable, which has been a huge problem for the NBA, especially in the last 5 years, with the Golden State Warriors being as dominant as they were, and of course with LeBron James in the Eastern Conference dominating things over there. You know, we just knew every single year before the season even began who was going to be in the NBA Finals, and to a certain extent, who was going to be winning the NBA Finals. And I think one of the exciting things about this season, with all the duos that we have here, just to go down the list, in the Western Conference, you have Kawhi and Paul George with the Clippers, LeBron and AD with the Lakers. So those two LA teams are just stacked right now. They have complementary role players to surround those guys. James Harden and Russell Westbrook combining to form another exciting partnership in Houston with the Rockets. And then to a lesser extent, you have Jokic and Jamal Murray in Denver. In Portland, you have Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum. And then with the Golden State Warriors, once Klay Thompson eventually gets back healthy, although we're not really sure whether he will even be back for this season, because it sounds like there are some rumors circulating out there that he's going to miss the entire year. But nonetheless, if he gets back healthy sometime this year, you can't discount the Splash Brothers in Golden State with Stephen Curry and Klay Thompson there. So in the Western Conference, you have all those duos matching up against each other. And then in the Eastern Conference, you have Embiid and Simmons ruling the East in Philadelphia. And then, of course, Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving teaming up in Brooklyn, although Kevin Durant isn't going to be playing this year. Overall, there's just a lot of exciting teams out there with dynamic duos that I think is going to make the NBA such an exciting league this season, which we just haven't seen in a long time. And for the first time in a while, I just don't know who is going to be winning the NBA championship. Like, I don't have a firm grasp of who's going to be coming out of the Western Conference or the Eastern Conference, whereas, you know, the past 5 to 6 to 7 years, I knew who exactly was going to be coming out of each conference, and there really wasn't much drama involved. It was just a predetermined, basically. When you look at some of the teams that are going to be in the contention this year, you know, I just think the NBA is wide open, more so than it has been in over a decade. You know, in my mind, there are legitimately 6 teams with a chance to win an NBA championship this year. And really, there are a couple other teams on the fringe that you could definitely make an argument for as well. In the Western Conference, I think the Clippers, Lakers, and, you know, surprisingly, the Denver Nuggets all have a legitimate chance of winning the Western Conference and winning a championship this season. And then you can't discount the Golden State Warriors either, because if Klay Thompson gets back healthy, yes, there are some holes on this roster, and I'll get to that later with some additional storylines that I want to see, but they're still a talented team as well. And I just can't discount Stephen Curry and the culture that they've built in Golden State there. You know, they're a championship-level organization, and if they're healthy going into the postseason, I wouldn't put it past them to go on a run late in the year and get to another NBA Finals. I just can't put that past them, even without Kevin Durant. So in the Eastern Conference, you know, it really comes down to 3 teams for me. And this might be controversial with the last one, but I think the 2 that everyone can agree on are the Milwaukee Bucks and Philadelphia 76ers. I think those are the 2 clear-cut best teams in the Eastern Conference right now. Obviously, with Milwaukee, you have Giannis Antetokounmpo, who's a one-man wrecking crew. Yes, the Bucks aren't as talented as last year's team, at least going into this year. But again, Giannis Antetokounmpo is the best player in basketball right now, and he can single-handedly take over a game and a season by himself. As for the 76ers, I liked some of the additions they made. I mean, I wasn't a huge fan of what they did this offseason. I felt like, they lost quite a bit with the departure of Jimmy Butler in free agency. Even though they were able to get Josh Richardson as a complementary piece in their starting lineup as a 3-and-D player, in that sign and trade deal with the Miami Heat, it's still, he was their closer for them last year. And I think they're going to miss that element when they get to the playoffs. But in terms of a starting lineup, I think this is as good as any starting lineup in the entire NBA. When you look at Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid as your 2, superstars on this team, so to speak. You have Tobias Harris, who's been an all-star in the past, even though I don't know if he really fit well with his team last season. Maybe without Jimmy Butler there to kind of take away touches from him, he will fit better this year. And then you go out there and you get Al Horford to be another defensive anchor in the paint for you on the defensive side of things, as well as a smart offensive player that can stretch the floor as a big man, shooting threes from the perimeter, and a great passer, very smart, fundamental player. I question the fit a little bit with Embiid and Horford as 2, modern-day centers trying to make it work together. But there is upside there in terms of them being quite possibly the best defense in the entire NBA. The last team that I think has a chance to actually win it all in the Eastern Conference is the Boston Celtics, I think, at least for this season. If Kevin Durant was healthy, I would say the Nets are a better team. But the Boston Celtics, I think, with some of the moves that they made, they definitely have a chance this season of kind of getting back on track here and making their way to an NBA Finals. And that leads me to my next storyline for the season is the Boston Celtics. Can they bounce back from a really disappointing 2018-2019 season where there was a lot of expectations for them? Gordon Hayward got back healthy, Kyrie Irving back healthy. You have Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown there, Terry Rozier off the bench, Marcus Smart still around. Al Horford was there last season. It was expected that team was going to make a run to the NBA Finals, especially when they almost upset the Cleveland Cavaliers in not last season's playoffs, but 2 seasons ago, the playoffs 2 seasons ago. And now with LeBron gone, would they take over the Eastern Conference? And it just didn't work out. The personalities on the team just did not fit. The younger guys thought that they, deserved a bigger role in the team. They didn't appreciate Kyrie Irving's leadership. Kyrie Irving definitely was not the best leader for that team. And, they faltered in the playoffs as a result. But I think with this offseason, moving on from Kyrie Irving or him moving on to the Brooklyn Nets, so to speak, and replacing him with Kemba Walker, who has a similar skill set and play style to Kyrie Irving, although I think while Kyrie Irving is a more talented scorer than Walker, I think Walker will be a much better fit in the locker room. And in this case, I think that might be an upgrade for the Celtics in terms of overall team chemistry and how this team fits. Now, they need to see some more progress from Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. Jaylen Brown did get a 4-year extension from the Boston Celtics, and that's pretty rare because Danny Ainge is usually pretty careful about who he extends, especially extending guys early. He likes to wait traditionally a little bit longer to the last year of those players' contracts. That way he has a better idea of how we can use them as a trade chip or what their value is in terms of free agency and stuff like that. They were aggressive in re-signing Jaylen Brown, which kind of signals to me that they really believe in his development and think that he's ready to take the next step as a player. We'll see if that works out this season, but Jason Tatum certainly needs to take the next step because after a really impressive 2018 playoffs where he just looked like the next big thing in the Eastern Conference in terms of being that next great all-star talent to match Giannis Antetokounmpo with the Bucks, he took a step back last year. He wasn't comfortable being the secondary option to Kyrie Irving. He got preoccupied shooting a lot of mid-range jumpers, and not really being efficient from the field as a result. His three-point shooting was not as effective as his rookie year. Overall, Jason Tatum kind of struggled a little bit in his sophomore season. So with another player in Kemba Walker who's more of a ball-dominant guard, even though he's a lot better of a fit as a leader, and he's going to be willing to share the spotlight a little bit more. Can Jason Tatum adapt to being the secondary option in the offense for the Celtics? We'll see. Certainly, they still have to work in Gordon Hayward, who looked, really rough at times last year coming off of that, just horrifying leg injury a couple of years ago. We'll see if he's back to playing at an all-star level. But to me, losing Al Horford for them was a big loss for this team. They haven't really replaced him in the offseason. They signed Enes Kanter, who's a great offensive talent, really good on the offensive glass, very good finisher around the rim, very good in the pick and roll, and can post up here and there as well. But he certainly doesn't have the IQ, the passing ability, the shooting ability, or the defensive presence as Al Horford. Al Horford really held things together for the Celtics on that end of the floor. I think the Celtics are going to miss that, especially with him going to a divisional rival. That's going to be a huge loss for them. So if they can bounce back from that and see some progress from their younger players, I think this team is certainly in the mix in the Eastern Conference. But, I think another storyline to watch out for in terms of teams that need to bounce back, how about the two teams that were in, the NBA Finals this past season, the Golden State Warriors and the Toronto Raptors? Now, yes, they were both in the NBA Finals, and the Raptors, of course, won the NBA championship. But there are a lot of questions going forward for these teams, not only for this upcoming year, but going into the future for years beyond for those franchises. Obviously, with the Warriors, I think it's fair to speculate whether their dynasty may be over. Obviously, Klay Thompson, like I mentioned before, it's rumored that he might be missing the entire season. At the very least, he's going to be out for the majority of the year. So he might be back for late in the year and go on that playoff run with them. But who knows? It just depends on how his body recovers and whether he's comfortable coming back, early enough off of that ACL injury. So we'll see there. But they were aggressive in the offseason, bringing in D'Angelo Russell in a signing trade. And I think that forms an interesting partnership with Stephen Curry. Stephen Curry is one of those unique players as a point guard in the NBA where he doesn't really need the ball in his hands to necessarily succeed and make an impact on the court, especially on the offensive side of the ball. So I think on the offensive side of things, they will form a really nice duo there because D'Angelo Russell, he's more of a ball-dominant player. He's more of a playmaker, more of a passer, and not the most natural shooter. Although he can shoot it a little bit, he certainly isn't on the level of Stephen Curry and Klay Thompson. So I think what they'll be doing here at the Warriors is D'Angelo Russell will be, having more of the on-ball duties, doing the ball handling and setting up the offense, and then allow Stephen Curry to allow his gravity and just his presence without the ball in his hands, moving without the ball, extending the court, drawing defenders towards him to really make an impact for a Warriors team that isn't as talented as previous years. Their bench isn't as good. And really the biggest problem I have with this roster as constructed currently is the lack of size up front. Right now, their center position is going to consist of Willie Cauley-Stein, Kevon Looney, and Marquise Chris. And honestly, that's just not very good in my mind, especially when you look at teams like the Clippers and Lakers who have multiple bigs that can make an impact. Willie Cauley-Stein is a nice rebounder and shot blocker and a rim protector, a guy who can be a vertical spacer in the pick and roll in terms of catching lobs and things of that nature. But, he's not an impact player by any means. Marquise Chris, he's bounced a lot around the league. He's a very talented player, don't get me wrong, a very young guy with a lot of upside. But, again, it's taken him a while to develop into a player that I thought he was going to be coming out of college. He's still a young guy, still figuring it out. Can he do it with the Warriors? I'm not sure. And then Kevon Looney, we all know who he is at this point. He's a solid role player off the bench, but do you want to really rely on him as your main big going into the season? I'm not sure about that. He doesn't really have the size or, imposing physical presence to be a rim protector in the NBA. He's just a very solid player. So those are some questions on the Warriors roster, but I think if they can get Klay back, that'll go a long way late in the year for them to go on a potential run. Now, for the Raptors, the loss of Kawhi Leonard is going to be an absolute devastating blow to this franchise. Obviously, I don't think Raptors Nation and their fan base should be mad at Kawhi Leonard for making his decision. He did what he thought was best for him. I'm personally not a huge fan of the move. I think when you win a championship in a city, I think you should stay for the long haul there. But, if he's not a fan of being in Toronto, he wants to go back home in LA, I can't blame him there, I guess. And, he won a championship for the city. I think this is the case with most Toronto Raptors fans, that they're very grateful for having Leonard there. But nonetheless, him leaving is a huge loss for this franchise. And now it's interesting because you have a guy in Pascal Siakam who really broke out last season as a guy that looks like a potential star in this league if he isn't a star player already. Now you're in the mold where you're going to be building this team around Siakam as a young player. They just extended him to a massive extension. And my question is, if this team isn't winning early on, do they kind of trade away some of their veteran talent and start over? I know they extended Kyle Lowry to a 1 or 2 year extension, but he's getting up there in age. He wasn't as effective in the regular season last year. You have Serge Ibaka on this team. He's getting older. Marcus Sol's on this roster. He's an older player, not what he once was. There's a lot of talent on this team. I think they're a playoff team in the Eastern Conference for sure. The upside just isn't there. So I'm just wondering if they're going to try and, whether they're going to retool or even go to a full-on rebuild, what this means for the Raptors here going forward. Certainly an interesting storyline to watch out for this season. And my last major storyline before going into the standings and how I think each conference will kind of shake out, I think one big storyline is just all the young, exciting teams all across the NBA that will just be exciting to watch on a nightly basis. In the Western Conference, for instance, you have the Dallas Mavericks with Luka Doncic and Kristaps Porzingis. With Dirk Nowitzki retiring last season, they needed another superstar to get into this organization to really help this franchise get back on track after a few years where they've kind of been in no man's land, so to speak. Not really rebuilding, but not really competing either. And the fact that they got Luka Doncic, brought him in last season, and he absolutely lived up to the hype coming from Europe as a rookie with a sensational rookie season. They didn't make the big trade to go get Kristaps Porzingis. So now you have 2 European young stars in the NBA to replace the greatest international European player of all time in Dirk Nowitzki. So it's an interesting thing for the Dallas Mavericks here. In terms of the rest of the roster around those two players, I don't think they're particularly talented or don't have the supporting cast to really complement those guys in the present. But looking forward into the future, those two guys, I'm really excited to see how they grow together because Luka Doncic, he's a great scorer and even better so as a passer. Great distributor of the basketball, great at running the offense. And then Kristaps Porzingis, he's a great shot blocker on one end, but he's a dynamic scorer in the half court as a 7'3" guy who can shoot the ball from three, take the ball down low, and be a vertical spacer in the pick and roll game when you can throw lobs to him. I think Luka Doncic is going to have a lot of fun playing off of Kristaps Porzingis in the pick and pop, pick and roll game, and those two are just going to have great chemistry together as two young stars for this franchise to build around. Some other teams that I like in the Western Conference, the New Orleans Pelicans, obviously. When you get the number one pick in the draft to get Zion Williamson, who unfortunately will be missing the first month and a half or so of the year due to a torn MCL, I believe. Not torn MCL, but he has a knee injury as of right now, so he just had surgery on that before the season started. So we'll see how that shakes out with Zion. But there's a lot of other young talented pieces on this team as well. With the trade for Anthony Davis, they got guys like Lonzo Ball, Brandon Ingram in there. I'm really excited to see what Lonzo Ball does now that he's outside of having to live up to the expectations in LA with the Lakers. He's no longer a part of that entire circus with his dad and Big Baller Brand. He's kind of doing his own thing now. I'm really excited to see what Lonzo does here, where he doesn't have to worry about all those things happening outside of basketball. He can just focus on his game on the court because he certainly has a lot of talents. I think he might have a chance to lead the league in assists this year if Zion can get back healthy and play at a high level that we saw in the preseason so far. I'm really excited to see what this team does. And they have some veteran talent here as well. When you look at J.J. Redick as a shooting specialist that they brought in free agency, Drew Holiday, who is a two-guard who's kind of approaching the prime of his career, a very underrated player, not necessarily a star player by any means, but a very good one nonetheless. They also brought in Derek Favors in free agency. Lots of talent on this team, and I'm excited to see how they grow and mature together as the season goes along. And then one final team in the Western Conference that I want to touch on is the Memphis Grizzlies. Obviously the number 2 overall pick, they had Ja Morant, selecting him, the point guard. And he's a very talented player, very good scorer, very good athlete, obviously, and a very, very talented passer. And I think he's going to fit well with the guy that they drafted in last year's draft, Jalen Jackson, the power forward, big man center, going into his second year. And Jalen Jackson is one of the most exciting young big men in the league, in my opinion, because he's just so damn versatile. He's a guy that not only is he a sharpshooter from outside, but he's got elite ability as a shot blocker as well. A very good athlete, and he can play either the 4 or the 5. He has a lot of versatility in his game. And if he can work on kind of diversifying his offensive skill set, this is a guy that's going to be a very dominant player in the league. And, same in a similar light to what Luka Doncic and Kristaps Porzingis can do in the pick and pop and pick and roll game in Dallas. I'm having visions of what, the Memphis Grizzlies can do with Ja Morant and Jalen Jackson in the pick and pop game, because that's a deadly partnership right there, I think, potentially. And I'm just really excited to see how that team grows. Now, going over to the Eastern Conference, the 2 main teams that I have my eye on this year are the Atlanta Hawks and the Chicago Bulls. With the Atlanta Hawks, there's just so much talent on this team. And you can see the blueprint of what they want to do in terms of building this roster. So they drafted Trae Young last season. And I think with that pick and all the other young talent that they brought in surrounding him, with John Collins, a guy that they drafted a couple of seasons ago at the power forward position. Kevin Huerter, who's going into his second year, a sharpshooting 3-point guy who he's a very deadly shooter in this league. DeAndre Hunter, who they traded up for in this past draft, the prototypical model of what you're looking for in a 3-and-D player in the modern-day NBA. And then Cam Reddish, a very long, athletic guy who has a nice-looking stroke from outside the arc, even though his numbers in college didn't really reflect that. He's got a lot of talent as a scorer in the NBA. And, what I see the blueprint of what they want from this team in terms of the vision of the front office and the coaching staff here is they're going to have a ball-dominant player in Trae Young who can shoot the lights out and is a phenomenal passer. He's a very gifted passer, very gifted with his eyes and the way he reads the defenses and the way he can just make passes from all across the court to anywhere at many different angles. You bring him in there, and you have a bunch of shooters to surround him, and you got a big guy like John Collins who can pick and pop, he can pick and roll. He's a very good rebounder. You have a recipe where you're just going to be tough to stop offensively, because Trae Young, not only is he talented in terms of getting to the basket, passing, and all that stuff, but now you surround him with shooters. That's just tough to stop. The only thing missing for this team in my mind is a legitimate center for them, a real guy in the middle of this team that can clog the paint, protect the rim, and be a physical presence on the glass for them. They're missing that right now. They have Alex Len as their starting center, I believe, and he's just not the guy. So if they can find a legitimate center on this team, I think this organization is on the right track. I wouldn't be surprised if they make a run towards the playoffs this season. There's a lot of talent here that I like. And then with the Chicago Bulls, obviously I'm a Bulls fan, and I kind of have a love-hate relationship with the Bulls, because on one hand, I'm a diehard fan and I want them to succeed and I want them to do so well. But on the other hand, I just can't stand Garpax, the GM duo that has been running this franchise for over the past decade or so. I just can't stand, some of the moves that they've made in the past. But I can't deny here that they do have an exciting young team building with the franchise here. You look at Zach LaVine, a guy that they traded for in the Jimmy Butler trade, and then Lauri Markkanen. Those are the 2 guys that they're building this team around right now. I don't know if any of those guys are, necessarily going to be superstars in this league. And I think if you're going to be building a young team, you need a guy who has the potential of being an NBA superstar. I don't see a guy on this roster capable of that right now. We'll see how this year plays out. And that's why I'm excited to watch these guys this season. But there is a lot of other young pieces that I am really intrigued by. You look at Wendell Carter Jr., who they drafted last season. He's a very versatile big, and I'm really excited to see how he can match, how he can fit with Lauri Markkanen in the front court. Because, when I looked at Wendell Carter before last year's draft, he really reminded me of a modern-day, younger version of Al Horford. And I think that's kind of the role that he's going to play with the Bulls here, where he's a smart player, very good passer at the high post, a guy who can score in the post a little bit, but he's more of a guy that you can run your offense through in the pick and pop game as a high post passer. And then defensively, he's got very good instincts. He's a very good shot blocker, and he's a solid rebounder as well. Just does everything very well, but nothing exceptionally great. But a very well-rounded player that I'm excited to see this season. And then they drafted Kobe White in the draft this year. And again, I don't know if he's got superstar potential, but he certainly is a very exciting guy to watch, very fast in the open court, a very nice shooter as well. And he's a guy that can get to the bucket pretty much at will. So there's a lot of talent on this Bulls team, and I'm interested in seeing how they mesh together as a franchise going forward with this young core. They certainly have a lot of work to do, though, so we'll see how that works out there. So now I'm going to move on to the standings predictions for this upcoming season, starting with the Western Conference. And I think for me, I'm going to start with the 1 seed and go down. So basically get you guys by playoffs first, and then, quickly go over, who's not going to make it and why. My first seed in the Western Conference is the Denver Nuggets. And while I don't necessarily think that they're the best team in the Western Conference or the NBA by any stretch of the imagination, I think this is a team that they're very young. They have experience from the playoffs last season, and I think they have a sneaky pick in terms of an MVP candidate in Nikola Jokic. Jokic, in my opinion, he is the best big man in basketball right now. Well, not best big man, because I think Anthony Davis is the best big man, but best pure center in basketball, it's Jokic, and I don't think it's particularly close. He's a guy that is basically the point guard for this team, which is, just insane to think about. A 6'11", 6'10" guy who's not the most athletic guy running the show for your offense. You don't see that ever in the NBA. Just in today's NBA, in the past NBA, you just don't see that. And he's just a very special player. And I think with how young this team is, they're not worried about, load management and, resting those guys for the regular season. They know that they need home court advantage in the playoffs as they're going to go on a big run to an NBA championship. So I think they're going to come out motivated to go out there and get as good of a record as they can, whereas teams behind them, and like I'll get to later, they're going to be more concerned about keeping their star players rested and just trying to get in sync before the playoffs necessarily. I think the Denver Nuggets, one thing that we didn't talk about last season, they were the number 2 seed in the Western Conference last year, and they had a ton of injuries that kind of really derailed what this team could have potentially been. Will Barton, their key 6-man off the bench, he missed some time. Gary Harris was injured quite a bit. Paul Millsap was injured quite a bit, missed a bunch of time. Really, it was Jokic who kind of held that team together last year. And with Jamal Murray taking that next step that we saw from the playoffs last year, being more of a consistent force as an offensive player, I think they're a team that is very dangerous in the Western Conference, and they're going to come out like gangbusters this year trying to get that number 1 seed, and that's why I think they'll be the number 1 seed in the Western Conference. And in terms of the number 2 and 3 seed, I have the 2 LA teams with the Clippers at number 2 and the Lakers at 3. And the reason why I have this is both teams are going to be, very cautious in terms of keeping their star players healthy this year. You look at Paul George coming off of shoulder surgery, Kawhi Leonard, who missed a lot of games last year with the Raptors. I think they're going to do a similar strategy this year where he's just going to sit a bunch of games just to keep rested for the playoffs. And we're going to see a similar thing with the Lakers here as well, where LeBron, I think they're going to try and rest him as much as they can because he's 35 years old and, at his age, he can't be carrying the team for 82 games like he did in his earlier stints with the Miami Heat and Cleveland Cavaliers. I just don't think that's a sustainable model for him at this age and at this point of his career. So I think those teams, while I think they're better than the Nuggets, they're not going to, it's not going to necessarily be reflected in their records in the regular season, because I think both teams are confident that they can win regardless of who has home court advantage. And I think both are confident in that once they get to the playoffs, they can be able to flip that switch and really turn it on. So those are my number 2 and 3 seeds. In terms of the 4 seed, I have the Jazz. I like the move what they did to go get Mike Conley in the offseason, making that trade. Bogdan Bogdanovic was a very underrated signing for them as well, I thought. And they were already a very, really an elite defensive team with Rudy Gobert in the middle of that defense. You have Joe Ingles there as a very solid player. And we'll see if Donovan Mitchell can take that next step as a player. He kind of had a down year as opposed to his rookie season last season. But going into his 3rd year, can he take a step and be a legitimate all-star type of player? We'll see. If he can do that, this team is most definitely going to be in that 4 spot, I think, because there is a lot of talent on this roster. In terms of the 5 seed, I have the Portland Trailblazers. A lot of people aren't really talking about them once again, but this team, all they do is just overperform compared to expectations. They have Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum as one of the best backcourt duos in the NBA. I like the addition of Hassan Whiteside in the offseason. He's probably going to be their backup big to Yusuf Nurkic when he's healthy and in the lineup. So I like that addition there. And they went out and got Kent Bazemore as well, trading Evan Turner to the Atlanta Hawks. So get Kent Bazemore. Kent Bazemore doesn't have the on-ball ability of Evan Turner, but he's a much better shooter, and he provides some defensive value as well. So I just think this is a good roster. They have a very good coach in Terry Stotts. Damian Lillard, he's one of the best point guards in the NBA right now, and he's one of the most clutch players in the NBA right now. So I think he's going to come out there very motivated this season to kind of carry this Trailblazers teams to a high seed and try and get them a good spot in the playoffs here. My number 6 seed is going to be the Golden State Warriors. And while I think they're going to be a lot more dangerous late in the year, they still have a lot of things to work out in the early goings of the season. How that partnership go with D'Angelo Russell and Stephen Curry in the backcourt. Can they get Klay Thompson back healthy on time? How's the bench going to be? Because they don't really have a lot of depth on this team as of right now. Can Draymond Green be a lot more consistent on the offensive side of the ball? Can their front court hold up? There's just a lot of questions for this team right now. But overall, I think with the culture that they have and Stephen Curry, I think he's going to have a monster year this year. He might be in the running for an MVP trophy as well. We'll just see about that. But I'm confident that they will be in the playoffs, and I think the number 6 spot is a good place for them as of right now. And then my last 2 seeds for the playoffs in the Western Conference are the Houston Rockets at 7 and the Spurs at 8. I'm going to start with the Spurs here at the 8th spot. I just can't see them not making the playoffs. I think there are some teams that might have a little bit more talent and are a little bit more exciting than them at this point, but they're still coached by Greg Popovich. DeMar DeRozan and LaMarcus Aldridge are solid players. They're getting Dejounte Murray back, who's a very good defensive point guard for them. They just extended his contract as well. It's just hard for me to not see this team in the playoffs because it's like clockwork every year. This team is always in contention. Maybe not in title contention this year, but they're going to be in playoff contention once again. And I think they're going to find a way to sneak into the playoffs here in a loaded Western Conference. As for the Rockets, this will be a bit of a drop for them compared to last season. And I'm just not sure about the partnership between Russell Westbrook and James Harden. I just don't think it'll work. I think Russell Westbrook is still a very talented and exciting player, but I've always found him to be overrated. I've never been a huge fan of his play style. I've always found that he plays a little bit too out of control. And I think his partnership with James Harden just won't work because, at least with Chris Paul and James Harden, Chris Paul had the ability as a shooter to where when James Harden is doing his thing in the pick and roll game and playing ISO basketball, that Chris Paul at least is a little bit of a threat as a shooter to where you have to respect that as a defender. With Russell Westbrook, you don't really have to respect him as a shooter. So, that defender could basically do a lot more to help off and, limit James Harden from having those wide open lanes to the hoop. It's a weird partnership for me, and neither of them are great defensive players. And personally, I just find Russell Westbrook to be not the same player that he once was. I think he's a guy that's on a steep decline coming soon. I think his athleticism is going to start to slowly decline, and he's not a skilled enough player at this point to really make up for that. So we'll see. I think they have enough talent on this roster to make the playoffs, but not enough to be legitimate contenders and not enough to go on a playoff run once the playoffs come around in the spring. In terms of the guys that will not be making the playoffs this year, I have the Pelicans in the 9th spot. Again, with Zion missing the early part of the season, I think they might get off to a slow start. There certainly is a lot of talent on this team. I'm really excited to see how this group, kind of fits together and what the chemistry is with this team. But I think they might be 1 year away from making the playoffs. Once Zion really starts to come into his own as a player, I think this team will be a lot more dangerous in the future. As of right now, I have them just missing the playoffs in the 9th spot. On the 10th spot, I have the Dallas Mavericks. Like I mentioned, I love the duo of Kristaps Porzingis and Luka Doncic, but I'm not really sure about the rest of that roster, so we'll see how that plays out. In the 11th spot, I have the Sacramento Kings. They really surprised me last season with how good they were for the majority of the year. They kind of lost steam towards the end of the season. But when you look at, they have Fox as your point guard, Buddy Hield as a shooting guard, Marvin Bagley down low. Harrison Barnes is all right as a small forward. I wasn't a huge fan of that trade when they made it last year, and the subsequent contract extension that Vlade Divac ended up giving him this offseason. But I think they're a young, exciting team, and I'm really excited to see what they can do as a follow-up to last season, where they kind of came out of nowhere. No one really expected them to be that competitive. So we'll see how they do in a Western Conference that is just getting better and better every year. In the 12th spot, I surprisingly had the Phoenix Suns in that spot. They've been in the basement of the Western Conference for, such a long time, it seems like. But I think they might have the right mix to finally go on a little bit of a run here and finally improve to where they're not just bottom feeders in this conference. I really like Devin Booker as a shooting guard for this team, as a lead guard. Ricky Rubio, bringing him in, he's not a great player, whatsoever, but I think he'll help Devin Booker in the fact that, Booker, he had to do a lot of the ball handling duties last season for this team because they just don't have a legitimate point guard. Ricky Rubio, he's a legitimate point guard. He's a guy that can run the offense, and he's comfortable making plays for others. And that'll make it a lot easier for Booker, I think, on offense, because now he can be more focused on moving without the basketball and more as a spot-up shooter, which he's more comfortable in anyway, I think. And that'll just go a long way, I think, for his development as a player. And then you have DeAndre Ayton, who, I expect to have a monster season after coming off a solid rookie year where he looked pretty good last season. So we'll see how he develops going into this year, but I'm excited by the young talent on this team. We'll see if it develops because, the Phoenix Suns as an organization are kind of a mess right now. So, we'll see how that works out here. In the 13th spot, I have the Oklahoma City Thunder. With Chris Paul, for me, it's not about, his talent level and whether he can lead a team still at his age, but it's more about the injury issues. He's a guy that is constantly missing games. He isn't the same player that he once was, obviously, and the talent on this team is just, doesn't really stand out compared to the other teams in the Western Conference. Danilo Gallinari is a solid player. I like the Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who they got from the Clippers in that Paul George trade. I really like him as a player. He's a fantastic young guard that I think will develop into, the future for this team at that position. And then you have Dennis Schroeder, Steven Adams at the center position. There are some solid players here, but, nothing that really stands out compared to the rest of the competition. The 14th spot, I have the Memphis Grizzlies. I like the combination of John Morant and Jalen Jackson. The rest of the roster, though, not good whatsoever at this point. And then in last place in the Western Conference, you might be shocked by this, but I have the Minnesota Timberwolves in last place in the conference. And that might be surprising for some because they do have a talented centerpiece in Karl Anthony Towns. But, I'm not excited by the rest of the roster. Andrew Wiggins is their number two. And, I've never been a fan of him. I always found him overrated coming out of college. And, he's been exactly what I thought he would be in the NBA. He's very athletic, and he can put up some stats here and there, put some points here and there, but he just doesn't make any impact on the court whatsoever. He's a very passive player. I've never been a huge fan of his game, and, he just hasn't developed into a guy that I think you can be comfortable with building your team around. And then, looking at the rest of the roster, Jeff Teague, was a solid starting point guard, but certainly nothing special. Covington, as a starting small forward, is all right, or power forward, stretch forward, whatever role they have for him. He's a solid 3-and-D guy, but, the rest of this roster just does not inspire me whatsoever. And they're in a tough Western Conference. I think in the Eastern Conference, I can make the argument that they're a playoff team. In the Western Conference, they're probably going to be in the bottom of the league this season. So switching over to the Eastern Conference now, obviously the number one spot, I have the Milwaukee Bucks repeating as Eastern Conference in the number one seed for the Eastern Conference. Like I said before, they're not as talented, losing guys like Brogdon in the offseason, Nikola Mirotic in the offseason. But with Giannis there, they still have some talented players like Eric Bledsoe, Chris Middleton's still there. They have the Lopez brothers. They're a solid team overall surrounding a superstar talent in Giannis Antetokounmpo, and I think they repeat as the number one team in the Eastern Conference. My number two for this year is this Philadelphia 76ers. Again, I have the Bucks and 76ers as the two best teams by far in the Eastern Conference. The 76ers will have some issues to work out. I think their bench isn't as good as I'd like it to be for a championship level team. and they still have some things to work out in the front court in terms of how Embiid and Horford fit together. But I can't deny all the talent in the starting lineup. They look really impressive on paper, and we'll see how that works out. The number 3 seed, I had the Boston Celtics. Like I mentioned before, I think they're going to really surprise people this year with how good they're going to be. Maybe not, contending for a championship once the playoffs come around, but I think if those young guys can start to develop, you start to see some more of that all-star form from Gordon Hayward, and Kemba Walker continues to play at an all-NBA level. I don't see why not this team can't, be in the conversation for the best team in the Eastern Conference. I think they have a lot of talent on this team. Brad Stevens, I still think, is a fantastic coach. And Danny Ainge, he's going to make moves during the season, I think, to improve this roster and kind of work on the holes on this team. So we'll see how it plays out. But I really like where they're at right now with the Celtics. My number 4 seed is the Miami Heat. I like the signing of Jimmy Butler in the offseason. They got rid of Hassan Whiteside, which I think was an addition by subtraction type of move for them. He wasn't a guy that really fit their culture overall, and he hasn't been the same player over the past couple of seasons anyway. But Jimmy Butler here, I think he fits well with the culture that Pat Riley, the president of basketball operations, has really set the tone for with his team. Eric Spoelstra is a fantastic coach still, and I like the rookie pick out of Kentucky, Tyler Hero, very good sharpshooter, very talented scorer on the offensive side of the ball. Him and Jimmy Butler are going to form a nice partnership, I think, as the 2 lead scorers in the backcourt for this team. They also have Goran Dragic still there. Justice Winslow still there as kind of a good defensive player, can ball handle a little bit as more of a slasher guy on the offensive side of the ball. There's some talent here on this Heat team, and this is an organization that prides itself on playing hard in every single game and really going out there and playing good defense, things of that nature, playing tough, physical brand of basketball. And, I think, they're going to surprise some people this season. My 5 seed is the Brooklyn Nets. Again, with Kevin Durant there, I think the conversation is a lot different in terms of them being maybe even the number 1 seed in the Eastern Conference. But with just Kyrie Irving running the show, I like the talent on this team. Just not enough for me to put him above some of the other teams ahead of them right now. I'm not really sure if Kyrie Irving is a guy that is capable of being the number 1 guy on the team without another supporting superstar, to support him. Didn't really work out in Boston. We'll see if it works out here with Brooklyn. Lots of questions in terms of can he be the leader for a young team. It's a similar situation to what Boston was the last couple of years, where you have Kyrie Irving stepping into a situation where you had a young team overachieve. They have a lot of young guys that think that they can do a lot more with a bigger role, and Kyrie Irving is kind of going to dominate things with the ball in his hands, and he's going to have to prove himself as a leader, I think, before making any more judgments about how good this team can be. My number 6 seed is the Toronto Raptors. Again, things could change whether they decide to rebuild this team or not, but if they do decide to keep the same core for this season and try to make one more go into the playoffs, to kind of keep their fans, satisfied coming off of the championship. I think this team is a very talented team this year. Last season, for instance, with Kawhi Leonard out, they won a ton of games without Kawhi Leonard. So it isn't like this team isn't used to playing without Kawhi Leonard and winning without Kawhi Leonard. It's just going to be tough for them to do it for over 82 games, I think, in my opinion. But with Pascal Siakam as the guy that they're kind of building this team around right now, I think they're still a talented team in the Eastern Conference, and we'll see how that works out for them. And so my final 2 teams to make the playoffs in the Eastern Conference are the Indiana Pacers in the 7th spot and the Detroit Pistons in the 8th spot. Now, with the Indiana Pacers, for them, it's really all about the health of Victor Oladipo. He's coming off of that brutal leg injury last season. I don't know where he's at in his recovery and when he's going to be back. But there is a lot of talent on this roster. I like the addition of Malcolm Brogdon for the Milwaukee Bucks. He's going to have to play in a bigger role this season as kind of the lead guard for this team early on until Victor Oladipo gets back. But Malcolm Brogdon is a player he's a very efficient scorer from the field and a solid playmaker and a very good defensive player as well on the perimeter. And then I like what they have up front when you look at guys like Miles Turner and his name's leaving me right now, but Miles Turner up front is a very good player at the center position. for them. Sabonis is the other guy. Those two have an interesting combination together as two big guys on this roster. I like the talent on this team. They overachieved, I think, once Oladipo went down with the injury last season, and they were a lot more competitive than I thought they would be. I thought, the Oladipo injury was going to be, a huge killer for this team last year, and it just wasn't. They really rallied behind each other and, impressed me with how well they were able to play despite losing their best player for the most part last season. So we'll see what happens when he gets back or when he gets back. But I think this team is too talented to not make the playoffs. And then with the Detroit Pistons, I just think they're kind of just mediocre, to be honest. Blake Griffin was one of the more underrated storylines I thought last year in terms of really breaking out and being a star player once again in the league. He's kind of had a few years where he's been injured and not quite the same guy that he was in the early years in LA with the Clippers. But last year, he probably had his best season as a pro. He was very effective on the offensive side of the ball, formed a interesting partnership with Andre Drummond in the front court. They bring in Derrick Rose, who had a nice year with the Minnesota Timberwolves last season. Maybe he can have a late career renaissance, a resurgence to, not his MVP form or all-star form, but, once again be a solid point guard, a very good starting point guard in the NBA. Although he might come off the bench initially, I think he's better than Reggie Jackson at this point. So we'll see how that point guard situation works out for them. But, besides that, the rest of this roster is kind of meh for me. But in the Eastern Conference, that's more than enough to get into the playoffs, I think. My number 9 seed, looking at teams that will not be making the playoffs this season, in my opinion, I have the Hawks. Like I said before, I really like the young talent on this team. I think they're a year away from making the playoffs. They need a little bit more experience. And again, they need a true center to really protect the rim for them on defense and just be a presence in the middle for them. But Trae Young is one of the better young point guards in the league. They have a lot of shooters, a lot of young guys on this roster. I'm excited to see how this roster and how this team kind of fits together this season. In the 10th spot, I have the Bulls finishing there. Again, I kind of a similar situation to the Hawks, where I think they're a 1 year or two away because, they only won, they haven't won 30 games in, a couple seasons here. They've been really bad the last few years. And I think it's going to take a while for them to learn how to win games. Young teams, it does take a while, to kind of mature and really fit together as a team. So we'll see how they fit together, but there is a lot of talent on this roster right now. I think they'll surprise people this year with how good they can be, but playoffs, I'm not too sure at this point. In the 11th spot, I have the Orlando Magic. And, this is a team that made the playoffs last season around Nikola Vucevic as their main guy. They drafted Mo Bamba last season. He didn't really do much as a whole. They have Aaron Gordon on this roster. For me, it's, they just don't have a point guard on this team that they can really build around. They traded for Markelle Fultz last year. I really don't know what to expect from him. He's a guy that, he's had just the worst luck in terms of injuries. One of the, weirdest situation with that shoulder that I've ever seen in terms of a storyline in NBA history. So I really don't know what to expect from him. If they can get anything out of that point guard position, though, I mean, sure, maybe they can go on a run, but this roster is kind of a mismatch of weird players kind of mixing together, and I'm not really sure what to make of them as of this moment. In the 12th spot, I had the New York Knicks finishing there. Their offseason was not ideal, to say the least. They were obviously going for the big-name superstar free agents in this last offseason's class, and they flat out missed. There's no way to go around it. They flat out missed, and I thought that their strategy of loading up on big guys with Taj Gibson, Julius Randle, Morris, Bobby Portis, it didn't really make a lot of sense to me. I didn't really like the direction that they went in free agency. Obviously they had some talented players, but the big question is, how does it all fit? I'm not really sure at this point whether it does. But I do like the addition of R.J. Barrett in the draft. They have some talented players on this roster, in terms of young guys that they can hopefully build around. We'll see. The only reason why I don't have them any lower is because the 3 teams I have below them are complete disasters at this point. And let's talk about them right now. The 13th spot, I have the Charlotte Hornets. They're really paying big money to Terry Rozier in free agency. They let Kemba Walker go, and they pay big money to bring in Terry Rozier who was a sub 40% field goal shooter for his entire career. Congratulations, Michael Jordan, the executive. Once again, you've nailed it. But on a more serious note, I just don't believe in this team. They're mediocre talent-wise all around. There's nothing special here. I don't think they'll be completely awful to the point where, they're tanking games and, going to be number one in the draft lottery. But, man, there's just nothing to write home about with this squad right now. There's no young guys that I'm excited about. They have a weird mix of veterans that they're overpaying right now. You'll get Nicholas Batum is a big example there. Not a big fan of this roster as a whole. The number 14 spot, I have the Wizards from the Washington Wizards. This is an interesting situation here because John Wall is going to be out for the year due to his, various injuries. That just a weird situation there. And they're kind of building this team around Bradley Beal, but there's nothing else on this team that excites me or whatever. There's no young guys to build around. The veterans that they have are, average at best. And honestly, the reason why I have them so low, because I think Bradley Beal can make them better with his presence alone and kind of bring him closer to a playoff spot than the rest of the roster would indicate. But, I just have a weird feeling that they're going to trade Bradley Beal at some point this season. I don't know when. It might be at the trade deadline, but we'll see because, they extended his contract on a 2-year extension. And the way I see it, it works out both ways because, for the Wizards' perspective, I think it makes sense because now, Bradley Beal was going to be going into his last year of his deal. You're not going to get a lot for a guy who, teams are not going to give up a lot of assets to get a player that might leave for nothing in the upcoming offseason. So by extending his contract 2 seasons, now other teams will see that, okay, if we go and want to make a deal for Bradley Beal, we'll at least have a couple more years of control over him. Where we don't have to fear of losing him for nothing if he doesn't want to be here long term. From Bradley Beal's perspective, again, it's a situation where he gets some max money coming in for the next upcoming seasons, and it gives him the freedom where if he does get traded, he'll still have the authority and he'll still have the ability to decide his own destiny in terms of demanding a trade and things of that nature. And it's not like he's going to be locked in for a long-term contract. Like if he gets traded somewhere and he doesn't like where he's at, he's not committed there for 4 or 5 years where he's going to be in a situation where he's stuck. So I think it worked out for both parties, and we'll see how that situation plays out this year. But my last place team in the Eastern Conference and really the entire league as a whole this year, the worst team in basketball for me is the Cleveland Cavaliers. Now, Kevin Love, he's a guy that I think they're going to try and trade at some point this season if he can stay healthy, which has been a huge question mark for him over the past few years. We'll see. Colin Sexton was a guy that they drafted in last year's draft. He was all right as a rookie. He's still learning how to play the point guard position. Outside of that, there really isn't much on this roster. They have John Beilein here as the head coach. Maybe he can turn things around coming from Michigan in the college ranks, but there's just not a lot of talent here, and we'll see. It takes a while to rebuild, and that's where the Cleveland Cavaliers are at right now. So overall, those are my thoughts on the NBA season that's coming up here in 2019-2020. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Thanks, guys, for watching. This is a really fun season, I think, coming up here for the NBA. And I'm excited because, as a huge NBA fan, I just don't know what to expect. And that's really what makes things fun. That's why the NFL is fun in terms of, what we're seeing right now in the NFL. I really don't know who's going to win in that league. And it's the same thing what's going on with the NBA so far. I really don't know who's going to win it all this year. And that just makes things so much better because I can't stress it enough. The NBA has been so predictable for such a long time that now that we're finally getting to see some competitive basketball all across the board, it just makes things so much more interesting. So thanks, guys, for watching. And yeah, please subscribe, and thanks, guys, for watching.